1:30 a.m. my time. I'm in Taiwan, and which is when we should be started. So let's get going. I've got quite a few slides here. I would like to make time for questions at the end, so I may go a little quick. Today we're going to talk about dissecting Tailwind, a design tokens tale. My name is John Alvin Wilkins. I live in Taiwan. I've been a Drupal developer for a very long time. Drupal 4.5, Drupal 4.5. And I've been a web developer for even longer than that. I just started working for Anertech. They're an Irish company. On Drupal.org, I am /u/John Albin. You can see all the stuff that I've done there. My website is john.albin.net, and my Twitter is John Albin. So let's get going. Right. So I first learned about Tailwind just like a lot of people just hear things about it on social media and stuff, and people talking about it, and it's like the cool new CSS thing. And last year, I was told that we were going to use Tailwind on a client project. So I went to the website. This is screenshotted right off of the tailwindcss.com website. And it says, I wanted to know more about it than what just the buzz. And it says, rapidly build modern websites without leaving your HTML. I was like, is this like JSX, where like the HTML is inside the JavaScript, but like it's inside your HTML? And I wasn't sure. And then they say a utility for CSS framework packed with classes like Flex, PT4, PB8, Text Center, and Rotate 90. I didn't know what some of those were, but Text Center, that means that every CSS property gets its own class, right? Actually, wait, no, it's worse than that, because it's every CS property value gets its own class. PT4 is padding top like 4, and PB8 is padding bottom 8, which is twice as big as 4. And I was like, oh, we're gonna use this on a project? I'm like, sure. I'm like, there's got to be a lot of things on the internet that talks about why this would be a bad idea. To the Googles. And I was gonna create all this huge long list of why we shouldn't use it, and then the project manager used just 2 words that countered all the arguments that I had for not wanting to use Tailwind on this project. It's a client requirement. Okay, fair enough. The client was using Tailwind on other websites. We were building a website for them. They wanted to leverage their developer experience of using Tailwind on other sites, so that when we finished, they would be able to take it over. That's an excellent reason for wanting to use Tailwind, right? So I decided to head back over to the Tailwind website and try to learn it like the right way, right? So we start at the top. There's actually a link near the top of the page from one of the primary developers. And he has this long article about why he created Tailwind in the first place. And he talks about how he used to write, semantic classes. And he has talks about using BEM. And then he gives this example where he says, if you've got this author bio that has a picture and then like a title, a heading, and then some body text, and then you've got an article preview, which is also an image, and then a title, and then some body text. BEM says that you need to duplicate all of the CSS to achieve semantic class names. So like one of the class names is author, and the other one is article, and you'll have all the same CSS, but in 2 different files. And I was like, what? Why? No, why would you do? BEM doesn't say that. And then I was like, ranted for like 10 minutes. And then I went and looked on BEM website, and yeah, that's actually what the BEM website says. It says that you have to use content semantics for your class names. And his critique of BEM is actually completely spot on. And I was reminded that, you know, BEM syntax is nice. Like, I've been talking about BEM for about 7 years, but the BEM class naming guidelines are garbage. Don't use them. Just because you've formatted your class names to like use the same syntax doesn't mean you have to name it using the exact same way that the BEM system says that you use it. So BEM syntax, it's all right. The whole BEM, not so good. Because HTML elements are where content semantics go, right? So this whole like author and article preview stuff, that should be handled with HTML elements. So like you would wrap those in like an article, right? The information about people's names, there are HTML elements that are specifically about, you know, names and stuff, and you should use HTML elements for content semantics, and CSS class names are about design semantics. I've been saying this actually for a very, very long time. I went back, found this almost exact same slide from 2014 when I talked at the DrupalCon in Austin. Nicholas Gallagher actually started this in 2012 when he said the same thing. You know, content semantics are HTML5, and class names should be about design, right? And Tailwind has taken this CSS class names are design semantics, and it taken it to its sort of logical extreme. Instead of creating these little component CSSs where you have like a card description, which is what that author component was, right? You have a picture and then a title and then some body text, and it's all inside this like box. That's like a card, a very typical name for a component that looks like that, right? And Tailwind has taken the idea of design semantics to its logical extreme with utility classes. And I got to describe what utility classes are. So what are utility classes? Like the original utility class that a lot of people who've been around for a while know is ClearFix, right? This was back before Flux and CSS grids. There were floats, and we had this weird behavior that if you put you had a div and you put two children in there and you floated them both, the parent couldn't contain those floated children. Like if you put a border around it, it would just like collapse on itself. And the ClearFix utility class, you would apply it to the parent and boom, suddenly it would like wrap around these floated elements. Utility classes do one very, very small thing, and they do it very well. That's what a utility class is. In Tailwind, you have one class which does one property and one specific value for that property. So PT4 means padding top, and then 4 is like the number that they consider like the default, and then everything is multiples of that. So if you want to have twice the padding, you would be PT8. PT12 would be 3 rem. That's what utility classes are. Okay. And then if you go and look at Tailwind CSS website, again, it actually says it's a utility first system, not just a utility class system, it's a utility first system. What does that mean? I mean, we've been using utility classes for a long time. Like ClearFix is a utility class. Right? Utility first is slightly different. It means you don't start with components at all. You just write utility class names like everywhere. So you don't create components to start with, and you're just using the utility classes that are available. So if you want to style a button, you create your button HTML element, you add your class attribute, and then you start typing utility classes into that class attribute. So BG bright blue 600 will give you a very specific background blue color applied to that class. Okay. And then you just keep going. You keep adding utility classes in order to style this button exactly the way you want it. So this is an example of a button on a real project that has all of the utility classes you need in order to style this button, right? Now, you make it into a component by taking this chunk of HTML and putting it into your Twig or your JavaScript if you're using React or Vue.js, right? So you're still creating components, but your CSS aren't made into components. They're just utility classes stuffed into your HTML. That's utility first. How do you know which utility classes are available? So tailwindcss.com/docs lists a whole bunch of utility classes that come with Tailwind CSS by default. I want to make that very clear. These are the default classes, utility classes that are available with Tailwind. You can go to the website and see all of them. And I'm showing you some here. So you can see, wait, I need to put a special laser pointer option. There we go. You can see that they have paddings, they have margins, widths, mid-widths, heights, and it just keeps going. Typography, there's font sizes, all the possible, not all the possible, but most of the CSS properties that are available have corresponding utility classes. And here you can see what are the padding classes available. This is quite a long list. to just pick the middle of the list. P36 means you're adding a padding of 9 rems. 36 is what, 4 times 9, so it's default padding. 1 rem is again 4 in the Tailwind CSS. So you can find all of their classes there. Now, again, this is by default. The Tailwind CSS file has 175,383 lines of CSS. I double-checked this about an hour ago. This is the latest version of Tailwind out of the box. Fortunately, 39,000 of them are blank lines, right? So you're only talking. So we're only talking about like 135,000 lines of CSS, and a lot of those are just lines with like an ending bracket, right? So probably every CSS class is like a CSS selector, then the actual property, and then an ending bracket. So that's 3 lines of code for every single actual selector, every single utility class. So we're talking about a third of 135,000 utility classes in there. Wait, I feel like these slides have been maybe a bit sarcastic. Why was I using Tailwind again? Oh, right. Thank you, project manager, for keeping me focused. I'm going to try to keep the sarcasm out of the slides from now on. I really am. I said there's 145,000 lines of code in there, which is true, but Tailwind has a solution for this, right? You're not supposed to deploy that to any website ever, except like when you're developing, right? And that's just on your local system. So when you deploy it to production, they have a very simple 2-step process for fixing this. Step 1 is, instead of using like the default classes, you should make your own utility classes, right? And the reason for that is like Tailwind doesn't know what kind of colors you need for the website, so they've got like all of them, pink and greens and oranges and all sorts of color. Like all the colors on this slide are inside Tailwind, right? You don't need that many colors on most websites. So like you can just like not use them, and then you'll have a lot less CSS. So how do you create your own utility classes, right? Tailwind has a file called tailwindconfig.js, and you just start writing like what kind of utility classes do you want to generate. And so inside this JS file, it's really simple. It looks like JSON essentially. It's pretty easy. You can specify I want to use these colors, and that'll override like the defaults, which include tons of colors. And I just want to use these certain set of spacing, and I just want to use a couple fonts rather than like, I don't know how many fonts come with Tailwind. It's a lot, right? But you may only need like 2 fonts, right? So that'll cut down on the number of generated utility classes. And it's really easy to configure this JavaScript file And then you just like rerun. There's a little utility that comes with Tailwind, and you just mix new CSS file. And doing that, we got our file down to like 88,000 lines of CSS. But this is still step one. This is still step one. Still step one, but you're specifying a limited set of your colors, your breakpoints, spacing, font sizes. There's all sorts of different things you can configure inside Tailwind.js, and just use what those that you need. And as you develop, you'll add some stuff. You can even like say, oh, I don't need this stuff, and you start removing things from it as well. This is really easy to use. I like it a lot. Step 2 is run purge CSS tool on your Tailwind CSS. This is really, really essential. Okay, this tool scans your entire code base and it will remove any unused CSS classes. That means like it's going to find your HTML, look through it, and see what actual Tailwind utility classes are used inside your markup, and then it's going to delete all of the unused CSS. Right? And now this gets file size way, way down to it's just the CSS that you actually used, right? So kudos for like figuring this out. This is this takes a system that seems like a joke into something that's super feasible to use. Right. And this is also Tailwind's big claim for CSS performance. It claims that your CSS grows slower using Tailwind than if you were writing components. And the idea here is that as you write newer CSS, like you're creating a new component, a lot of those CSS properties you're adding in the new component are the same ones you've already used on other components. So there's only going to be a couple new CSS properties, and therefore only a couple new utility classes that get generated and then saved in your generated output. So as your code base grows with more and more components, they're claiming that your CSS is going to sort of plateau and just grow very, very slightly. And that's a lot better than if you were writing a bunch of CSS for every new component, so that as you add additional components, your CSS grows in proportion to the number of components that you have. Tailwind gets rid of this sort of linear coupling of CSS growth and component growth. This is its big claim to fame. This is not a trivial thing. This is important to consider, right? It has trade-offs, right? So the first thing that I've wanted to explore, but haven't got a chance to explore, is bundling CSS. I've been writing a lot of JavaScript, React components, and we have all these bundlers, Webpack, right? So that if you are creating a bundle of JavaScript and CSS just for a specific set of pages, the CSS that's included with that bundle is only used in that bundle. But Tailwind's CSS is global for every single page. So you can't do bundling as easily, right? So, Drupal has a bundling concept as well. With libraries, you just say, when I use this twig file, I want to use this little chunk of CSS. So by adding a library per twig file, you also get bundling, and it collects those CSS per specific pages. This is a tricky front-end performance thing to do. It's not as simple, oh, I'll just do bundling and then everything's fixed, right? You have to be really careful with it. Tailwind makes this a completely different way to think about it. So you just have to take that into consideration. You won't be able to do some things. You will be able to do other things. We'll have to figure it out. Let's start doing some gotchas. Oh, I only got 10 minutes left. That's a gotcha. Okay, source order gotchas. In JavaScript applications, it's common to if you have this new property, you're just like, oh, I'll just pop another class onto this component in order to change how this component looks, right? Here's some HTML. Let's say it has a text base class by default, and then you add like a small property onto your component, and then it pops in this text-small CSS. It adds that class name in addition to what's there, and this won't work at all. It's not going to make your text smaller because text base is already on there, and the generated CSS, the source order matters. Text base and text small have the same specificity of one class, and text base comes after text small in the CSS file. Therefore, it's impossible for the text small class that's added to override the text base class. It just won't work. So if you're using a system like this, you have to swap the classes. You can't just like pop a new class on and assume it's going to override stuff. So this is different than a lot of other JavaScript systems, React, whatever. So when you're doing it in React or whatever, make sure that you're swapping rather than just popping on additional classes. And this is generated CSS, right? So it's not CSS that you write and control. You have no control over which order this goes in, right? Yeah. Next thing, dynamic class name gotchas. Here's a little bit of JavaScript that we wrote once, totally broke purge CSS. We created this JavaScript string that was concatenated. It took text dash and then like this size that we got from this React property, as it became like text dash SM, right? Except that purge CSS cannot see that it's text dash SM inside our HTML. And so it strips the text dash SM and text dash, it doesn't see any of those classes because they're not statically in the JavaScript. So purge CSS will get rid of them from your CSS. This entire component will die when you use purge CSS on it. That's a gotcha. Make sure that when you see props.size, you can still use that, right? But now you need to like toggle between different static strings, like text-sm has to be a string inside this JavaScript file. Otherwise, purge CSS won't see it. Text-md has to be an actual string. That's a gotcha. Don't let it get you. Drupal gotchas. Purge CSS has to scan your twig files, and you can't let the content editor use whatever Tailwind class they want, right? They can't go to Tailwind website and just pick a class there and just start inserting it into like a WYSIWYG or like a views configuration or whatever. That's not going to work because that means you can't run purge CSS because purge CSS can't scan your database. It has to scan actual code. So if you're configuring your WYSIWYG, every WYSIWYG class, a lot of times people have a WYSIWYG.css file that they insert into Drupal WYSIWYG in order to do the styling. You have to make sure that all of those class names in that file are also in code in some way that purge CSS can see. Just because it's in CSS, like that's what purge CSS does. It reads those classes and goes, oh, I'm not used in code anymore, and it gets rid of them. So you have to make sure that you've copied those class names into code somewhere that purge CSS knows. Or there's like exclusions. There's configuration you can do, but you have to make sure that you do that configuration so it doesn't delete those specific set of CSS classes. And then you have to give that specific set of CSS classes to the content editor to say you can use these, and that's it. You can't go to Tailwind website and expect it to do this other stuff because it won't work. Okay. Oh man, I'm totally running out of time here. What are design tokens, right? So went back to the Tailwind config.javascript. We talked about a limited set of colors and breakpoints and spacing and font sizes that we were configuring inside there. Well, those are all design tokens. Like specifying a limited set of colors is a set of design tokens about colors. You can have a limited set of spacing. Those are your design tokens. Here's some examples. Here's some font size tokens. This is a complete set of font size tokens that I have on a recent project, right? I'm using CSS variables in this case. And you can see here by my default setting here is font 100 and it's 1 rem. And the designer can use any of these tokens for doing any font sizes anywhere in the component system, in any component, but only this set. That's what design tokens are all about giving you flexibility, but also limiting the scope of your components. Because when you start just picking willy-nilly like CSS values, your design system starts to break down and look very inconsistent. Design tokens about creating consistency and limiting your set of literally variables that you're using inside your components. Creating a design system with design tokens in CSS variables. This is something that I've tried recently. It's working out pretty good. Still in the experimental stage of it. I'm gonna go back to the size fonts again here. So not only can you just have very like numerically based or very abstract ways of thinking about the font sizes, you can have more semantic design contexts around the design token. So for example, this heading 1 on desktop reuses one of the design tokens for a specific font size, right? And so here we have we have design tokens that are named easily to remember, like, oh, what do I need to use for headings? Well, now we've got a whole bunch of tokens that are just about headings, and it hides the actual values from you, so you don't have to remember those values or like look them up somewhere. Tailwind CSS recommends that you get an IDE, a text editor that can do auto completion, and this totally works for this as well. If you start, I can never remember some of these CSS variables, but if I type, some font size colon and then var open parens and then just type heading, it's going to autocomplete and bring out just these CSS variables for me. Super helpful. Definitely recommend you use those. Here's a limited set of spacing. These are the spaces in between components. Really recommend you also use spacing for your design settings. Let's do, how many slides do I have left? 10 more slides in like 2 minutes. Naming things again. How to name your design tokens. Tailwind uses abbreviations for everything. PT4, really hard to remember. This is a level of abstraction that has a huge cognitive load for my brain. I already know a lot about CSS, and making me remember an additional class just so I can do padding top, like, it's too much for me. That's a huge cognitive load. I've got double, actually more than double, right? I have to remember classes for every single property and every single value. My recommendation again is don't abbreviate things, right? So again, you have an IDE that does autocomplete. I'm typing my variable, I type spacing, and it's going to find size spacing 200 for me on a list of spacing variables, right? How to name your design tokens. This is a mistake I keep making over and over again, and Tailwind actually makes the same mistake, which is extra small, small, medium, large, extra large, 2XL, great. And then the designer, you go through the designs and you find like an extra font size that's right in between your medium and small, and now you've got medium, small, and you have a 2XL and in between large, you now have a 2 large. This is bad. But I figured out a little trick where if you name your font sizes and all of your design tokens, if you can try to name them based on like percentages, it becomes really easy. So here we have a font size of 100 is 1 rem, right? And then we had, so that's 16 pixels, and we had 32 pixels and all these different ones. And then this one got added later because we realized that there was an 18 pixel size that was hiding in one of the components. And it fits right inside our naming convention because it's percentage based of our base. This solves all this problem of like 2XLs and this 100% stuff naming works so good. I try to do it for everything, even for colors. For colors, you use the L in HSL, right? So the lightness factor in your HSL color space. So gray, if you pump it up all the way to the lightness all the way to 100, you get FFFFF, which is white. And if you bring the lightness all the way down to 0, that's 000, that's black. And now your gray 00 is essentially black, and your gray 100 would be white. And then all these numbers are based on the lightness value in HSL. I really like this way of doing design token naming. Super helpful. So what do I think of Tailwind? I'm going to finish this up in like a minute, I swear. You have concerns. You can't do any bundling. You have global CSS. You have abbreviations, messy HTML, source order gotchas, dynamic class name gotchas. But why might you use Tailwind, right? This is required. Yeah, never mind. Okay, Tailwind's better than Bootstrap. If you're using Bootstrap, Tailwind's a better system. I would seriously consider migrating from Bootstrap to Tailwind. But this is not the only one. This still seems very sarcastic. I'm being serious here, but it still feels a little sarcastic. This one, I'm completely, there's a very good reason for use Tailwind. And it's not every developer on your project that's writing HTML may know CSS that wow. I've seen some really bad CSS from people who are trying to, code well. But with the Tailwind system, you can have one good front-end developer control everyone else's CSS. This is a big deal. And this is something you should maybe consider doing if that's the limitations of your project. You don't have that many front-end developers. Yeah. So thank you. Only 1 minute over. Woo. I'm going to post my slides to my website. I've got a really long URL, but it's too long. So just follow me on Twitter. I will post the URL there. I'm at John Albin on Twitter. And I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions. I'll try to stay in the chat as long as I can and answer questions there. Also, you can ask me questions inside Twitter. Also, there's like this whole hop-in thing where you can network and things, and I'll be around and ask me questions there as well. So thank you very much. And I hope you all have a wonderful DrupalCon. Bye.
John, just a note, there are some questions in the Q&A tab. So click in there. Yeah, there's questions in there. So, I mean, you could just quickly rapid fire and just go through them if you wanted to, or you could do it in the chat, either way.
Okay. Yeah. Have you had to resort to, I'm reading these just straight off. I haven't read them ahead of time. Whoops, it disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay, I got a reverse order. So Sale Tailwind purge, then are we digging through Drupal templates and PHP files to identify what we don't purge out? That's exactly right, Chris. You're gonna have to go through PHP files and Twig files in order to find which which utility classes are actually being used. Do you ever use BEM with Twig to make it cleaner to read what components are? BEM with Twig. I mean, like, that's one thing that's nice about BEM versus BEM syntax again versus Tailwind utility classes is that you have fewer classes inside your markup, so it's like easier to figure out what's going on. I have a hard time seeing that mess of utility classes on a single markup and figuring out what the heck's going on. So I quite like, from a developer experience standpoint, having one class name there and then all my CSS in a CSS file. Do you think this reduces the amount of CSS that gets spit out? And as a CSS purist, how do you feel about living in the HTML? Well, I mean, like, I'm a web developer, right? So like living in the HTML is like that's what I did originally before they had CSS. So I'm totally fine with that. JSX is a JavaScript way of, it's like JavaScript and HTML and CSS all together. It's like, next level peanut butter cup going on there. So I'm totally fine with that. Do you think this reduces the amount? So do I think that Tailwind reduces the amount of CSS that gets spit out? Over the long term, that's what they're claiming. Sounds right to me. I think that there might be ways to automate taking theoretically, we should be able to figure out taking our component CSS and converting those into utility classes at an automated level. That might be possible, in which case we would get all the benefits of using Tailwind without using Tailwind, but that tool doesn't exist yet. So like that's just a hypothetical thing. So I'm not going to compare Tailwind, which exists and works right now, to something that might theoretically exist in the future. How do you get that to work with styles used in content? How do you get that to work with styles used? Oh, Frank. Oh. I think what you're asking about is like if you've got a WYSIWYG editor and then you're like injecting CSS. Sorry, you're injecting markup like from the database essentially into components, and then a lot of times we'll write some CSS that uses like parent selectors, right, to add styles inside the Drupal field from the wrapper that's actually the wrapper HTML element that's actually in our twig file. You would have to still write some component CSS in order to do that. Tailwind comes with a utility that allows you to essentially use utility classes as mixins, right? It integrates super well with post CSS. It becomes a post CSS, basically treats like Tailwind like a utility class. Sorry, Tailwind has a post CSS plugin that allows you to specify utility classes inside regular CSS files, and then it converts that into the actual Tailwind property values. That's built into Tailwind. The post CSS plugin is built into Tailwind. You can use that, and you would be able to do stuff like style from a parent wrapping HTML element. Compare Tailwind CSS to using Tailwind like utility definitions as Sass placeholder classes and calling them those placeholders in a component-based CSS class names, similar advantages. Oh, percentage placeholder classes in Sass. I think that yeah, actually, now I know what you're asking. It might be. So if you created a whole bunch of utility classes in Sass with percentage placeholders, you might be able to do something very Tailwind-like with your Sass. I've not tried that. Excellent question. So you don't need all those style sheets that are included when using Sass. I'm missing some context there. It was probably something I was saying at a time in the presentation. Okay. How does this affect the overall weight of HTML of a page, right? So you've inserted all these utility classes into your HTML. How does it affect the HTML size? It affects it a little bit. However, most HTML pages served by websites have gzip compression on them. And utility classes have a lot of repeatable bits in the class names, and those get squashed down really efficiently by gzip. So it has very, very tiny performance aspects to having all those utility classes inside the HTML. It's actually pretty good. Have you had to resort to also using custom CSS because of a case where the CS needs some more context? Yeah. There are things that Tailwind can't do, and the Tailwind specifically will tell you about this. It does support breakpoints. I didn't mention that. It totally supports breakpoints with utilities that are breakpoint specific. But sometimes, like animations, you'll have to write a little bit of custom CSS, and you just like bundle that, custom CSS with your global CSS. You get served to every page. Okay. So what do you recommend instead of Tailwind / Bootstrap? I like I said, I've started to use design tokens just inside CSS variables. I've been using post CSS. That's still my favorite tool. I used to use Sass a ton, but I've switched over to post CSS because it allows me to write like vanilla CSS, but also like the future spec that hasn't yet been implemented in browsers. Post CSS has a bunch of plugins that allow you to write new syntax, not available in browsers, and then it basically, those plugins then like they transpile that future spec into regular CSS that can be understood by browsers now. And I really, really like using post CSS in that way. Have you ever used a design app like Sketch or Figma to import design tokens into Tailwind? Yes, I am currently using, I think it is a Sketch import into zero height application, which then has all the design tokens in there that get exported into Amazon has this utility called Style Dictionary. So it goes from Sketch to zero height, and then zero height into Style Dictionary. And Style Dictionary allows you to have this JSON file with all your design tokens in them, and then it can convert it into all sorts of different formats. It can create it into CSS variables. It can also create JavaScript variables. It can create a JavaScript module or a JSON file for you. It can even create the things that you need to create Android apps. I don't know what kind of format that is in, but it does that, as well as like Swift apps on iOS. All of that from the Style Dictionary tool. I've just started using it. It's pretty slick, and I'm not using nearly all the power that's available in it. But yeah, it's an interesting combination. If you've ever used Bootstrap 4 and all the triggers are thus present, wouldn't Tailwind check all of them and add stuff even if you are not using that template? This is a good point. If you've got a bunch of HTML that actually isn't used in your app, you can't scan through those components because then you're adding extra CSS. So you would need to, that's the nice thing about JavaScript bundling. And inside a JavaScript tool, it knows which JavaScript components actually get pulled in. I mean, that's what Webpack's job is all about, figuring out which chunks of CSS and JavaScript and HTML actually is used, and then bundling it up. Tailwind wouldn't have any way of knowing whether a component is used or not. You would have to configure it to say, don't look at these, or like you have to move them into a separate spot in your Git repo so that you're segregating the used and unused components. It might be a little tricky there. I haven't used that a bunch. Can you use Tailwind with BEM to make the HTML easier to read? You can absolutely reconfigure Tailwind to do different utility class names. So you wouldn't have to use those PT4. It could be like padding top 4 or something like that. It would be much easier to use. So it wouldn't need to be BEM, just something more verbose. Yeah, you can configure Tailwind config.js. I'm pretty sure there's an option in there somewhere to do something like that. And the last question is, how soon are session recordings available? I don't know.
They said 24
yeah.
hours. That's what I've heard. 24 hours. They got to process them.
There we go. All right.
Wow.
Thank you all
John.
so much.
That was
I
the best rapid fire questions I think I've ever heard. You really went through it. Amazing.
Cool. Well, I'm going to drink some water. My voice is going. Thank you again. Bye.